Hello, guys and gals. We are back to finish the 20th century unit for our humanities class. Now, last time in your notes, we discussed the philosophies that are at play in the culture during the 20th century. We discussed the major conflicts in the world wars and the Great Depression. And then we covered the human rights atrocities, a variety of them. We had you go and research and then hopefully report back on what you learned therein and identify some of the major causes of so much of the violence in the 20th century. Now, we're going to shift for this particular part of the unit away from the actual wars, like the physical wars. We're going to go into the culture wars that sort of emerge after the world wars, kind of fizzle out, in other words. Now, what we're going to do here is we're going to begin with a discussion of some of the different psychological theories, rather, some of the different psychological theories that are emerging at this period in history. And I throw this in there because psychology really becomes a thing in the 20th century. It's not really a quote unquote thing. It's not a presence. It's not a major science during the other centuries or millennia in history up until this point. And I like to throw them in there as sort of other voices, other, parts of the conversation that are surrounding all the different philosophies in the culture at this time in history. So we begin with Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud is probably rightly considered to be the major father of psychology as we understand it today, or at least psychoanalysis as a theory in psychology. If you want to know more about him, you can take a look at our universal materials video when we talk about how to use a Freudian lens when analyzing art and literature. I'm not going to go through him in immense detail here, in that much detail, but it's good for us just to be familiar with Freud's general theories. So Freud developed a theory that organizes the human psyche into three major categories: the id, ego, and superego. Freud says that the id in our human mind, our human psyche, is essentially all of our baseline, primordial, animalistic, what kids might say, lizard brain, intrusive thoughts sort of dimension to our psychology. So all of your desires, sexual, primal, food, all this kind of stuff, all these base desires come from the id. Then we have the ego, which is our conscious mind, whereas the id is the subconscious. So it's a big point about Freud. He creates this, or he kind of understands this idea of having a conscious mind, a conscious psyche, and then the subconscious, the unconscious mind, right? Something below our awareness, things that are happening in our mind that we're not aware of. And then above all of this, you have this, the Freudian superego, which is essentially the part of our mind that determines, or how we perceive, how we perceive what we should do or how we should behave. It's sort of the should part of our brain, right? And that's kind of, we have the interplay between all three of those points making up the Freudian dynamic, essentially. He invents this, or he creates, or he articulates this idea of repression, how when we have something traumatic happen to us, particularly in childhood, our mind, as part of a defense mechanism for our psyche, will repress it and put it into our unconscious mind, and it will kind of stay there, but it will also sort of affect the rest of our behavior unless it's treated and understood and kind of integrated into our understanding of the world. It will kind of affect us in a negative way and result in dysfunctional behavior. Freud's very big on the sexual drive, as I just kind of mentioned. He really thinks that one of the major motivating forces for people in their psyche and therefore in the world is a sexual drive, right? That comes from the id that we're trying to constantly deal with or integrate, repress, all that kind of stuff, right? So Freud's big on that aspect of human nature. Now, the next one that we have here is Carl Jung, the student of Sigmund Freud, who is also in our lenses of analysis, if you go look at that video on universal materials. And Carl Jung differs pretty dramatically from Sigmund Freud, simply on the basis of their general outlook on human nature or on the human story. Freud is generally a big pessimist. He thinks that the human story is going to be quite tragic, whereas Jung thinks that a human story can be quite heroic and we can kind of overcome our major flaws and our major errors. He also kind of goes along with Freud with the theory of the subconscious, but he adds on the unconscious and slash subconscious mind, but he also focuses on, or he articulates this idea of the shadow, which is a part of our psyche that he sees as the darker part, the hidden part, the more aggressive and more, embarrassing and maybe even immoral part of our minds that we are struggling to integrate in either in the form of aggression, sexuality, resentment, all this kind of stuff. He believes that the self is essentially the conscience that we're trying to develop. So that same thing as the Freudian ego, right? The superego, rather. We're trying to always learn and develop our understanding of morality and right and wrong and impose that on ourselves properly. The persona for Carl Jung is an idea of a sort of like a false self that we present to the world that is socially acceptable, and we are trying to have the interplay between our persona and how our authentic selves are, so that we present the world a authentic version of ourselves, but an appropriate one that's not a complete no filter version of ourselves. We're trying to also avoid the process of presenting a completely false face to the world so that you hide who you truly are, or even worse, so that you forget who you truly are and you just keep acting out this persona. For Carl Jung says this is a bad and unhealthy thing to do. We need to integrate proper social norms and dynamics into ourselves so that we can be ourselves but also be appropriate. Then the anima and the animus is a big part of his psychology as well. It's this interplay between our anima, our feminine spirit, and our animus, our masculine spirit of our gender slash sex that we're trying to create an interplay between. And the big theme with Carl Jung is that you need to learn to integrate and mature all of these things into yourself properly. So you do need to integrate part of the shadow into yourself. You need to kind of control your darkness. You can't just repress it and excommunicate it. You need to integrate it into yourself to become a fully whole and competent and impressive human being. Same thing goes for the self, same thing goes for the persona and the anima and the animus. They all need to be balanced and integrated into you properly to make you a whole person. So that's his idea. And then Frankl comes on the scene, and he's kind of a response in some sense to the existentialist and the crisis that someone like Nietzsche brought to the scene, where we have this advent of nihilism and nihilistic existentialism, this crisis of meaning, this crisis of finding purpose and true meaning and value in life. Viktor Frankl comes on the scene and kind of disagrees with Freud and says, no, it's not sex that we're really looking for, it's meaning. It's fundamental meaning that's going to drive us through life and help us endure the tragedies of life. That is what we're trying to do. We're trying to fill the existential vacuum in our hearts and our psyches, okay? And that is what we're doing. We're trying to search for that meaning to give us the true kind of bolster against the suffering of the world. And all of these boys lived through World War II in various different degrees. I mean, Sigmund Freud had to flee and then died shortly after World War II really began. Viktor Frankl was actually someone who went through the Nazi concentration camp in Auschwitz. He actually lived through it. He wrote a very famous book, Man's Search for Meaning, which I have over here on my shelf always. I tell all my high school students that if you read, top 3 things, if you read nothing else, like one of the things you really should read is definitely Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. It's a great affirmation of the existence of meaning and purpose and value in our lives. And it's a fantastic story and fantastic theories as well. So go check him out. All right. So when it comes to psychology for our notes, all I'm simply asking you to do is give us some of those basic models, give us some of those basic ideas that these boys are introducing to the discussion. And we're going to actually talk about where those come in for these next issues that we're going to explore. So the culture wars. Now, what is a culture war exactly? Well, it's generally a conflict between two competing philosophies or competing directions as to where people think we should go in society. And the cultural aspect of that is where people see issues in society and they think, aha, this is an issue. This is a battleground for that culture war. The result of this issue or the result of this conflict or the direction that we choose to take on this conflict is going to be either a victory or a loss for one side of those cultural visions. So we're going to go through and we're going to look at a variety of different cultural issues, cultural conflicts. Okay. And what I want us to do essentially is take some notes on these things. Now, when it comes to the policies, cultural policies, that's kind of a separate one. But I want to get first and foremost to the political one, the kind of grander, more governing and political philosophies as one of the starting points here. So the positives and negatives of each of these systems. Now, the systems, excuse me, that we are debating or that we're discussing here are capitalism and communism / socialism. This becomes the major ideological battleground where we see the Cold War essentially breaking out. And we're not going to talk too much about the Cold War. We're not going to talk about all the different conflicts therein. I prefer to just talk at least at the level of ideology so we can get kind of an idea as to what was really kind of driving a lot of that conflict. Now, we talked a little bit about capitalism, a little bit about communism since the Enlightenment. We talked a little bit about it last time, at least with the governments, how the governments were behaving in those systems. Let's talk about it here. So, one side of the aisle, the communists, the socialists, believe that we should redistribute wealth from other classes to those in more need, possibly making society more equal. Okay. So here is a philosophy, here is a policy or a worldview that says we can essentially make the world more and more and more equal. We can bring about what is essentially a somewhat better situation, a almost utopian situation where through our various means and understanding and cleverness of policies and redistribution of wealth, we can bring about what is effectively a utopian society where all people are, if not completely equal, then much, much, much more equal than they were before. Okay, that's the essential communist / socialist, ideology. On the other side, we have the capitalists, which believe what? They say we should allow people to work and compete for more money in an open market, possibly making all people more wealthy. Okay. So the capitalists want an open and free market for competition and for advancement and work. They want to say basically that, hey, if someone wants more money, wants a better position in life, they should be allowed to pursue that freely and fairly. You should be allowed to, regulate what is a fair means of competition and kind of go for that. Whereas they might also say if someone does not want to do that, then they should be allowed to basically sit and be happy with the means that they've made. So they're not saying we need to go and compete against everybody, but you can if you want to, essentially, and we should be free to allow this to happen. These two groups are in major competition, and we see the ideologies of those two sides causing a huge rift in many different deeper ways. At one level, there's a clear economic and political difference that they have, right? That's kind of the clearest one. There's a social aspect to it too, where we don't like the inequality that has been clearly evident between the upper and the lower class, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, as Karl Marx would call it. We see this, we don't like it. We see at a deeper kind of cultural level the distinction between these two. Why? Because there are worldviews that attach themselves to these ideologies as well. And something we didn't mention when we discussed those ideologies at the beginning of this unit is that they can overlap quite a bit. So, for example, which ideology tends to overlap a lot with capitalism? Well, it would be kind of traditional conservatism and traditional liberal democracy, liberal kind of secularism tends to overlap with capitalism quite a bit. And therefore, what else overlaps with capitalism at a deeper level is the kind of Judeo-Christian and even religious fundamentalism sometimes. So you have that group, if you want, sort of being closer knit together, right? And then on the other side, you have clearly Marxism lines itself up with capitalism quite a bit, but you have sort of liberal progressivism also start to link up with communism. This idea that human societies are progressing and progressing and progressing, getting better and better and better, and we need to kind of keep pushing that improvement more and more and more. And one of the things that usually lines up with that rather nicely is something like secularism or scientific naturalism. So sometimes those will kind of be partners in their ideologies as well, but not always. Again, these ideologies can be very, very different, very much in flux, but generally we see those kind of being linked together sometimes. All that to say, every other issue, therefore, is linked in some way together, and this particular issue becomes the major problem in the Cold War, where we have a culture that wants to maintain capitalism, maintain what America has set up, maintain its religious Judeo-Christian values, and then we have a group that wants to remove what we have built so far, wants to kind of move beyond what we've built so far, wants to even remove the Judeo-Christian values that we are in the Judeo-Christian systems that we've made, and kind of create something new, essentially, in the form of communism or socialism. So that's the real kind of tension we see in the Cold War. And of course, the culture war happens where we see potential influences of those ideologies, right? The most famous example, of course, would be in like Hollywood, right? We have Hollywood movie makers, producers, actors pushing quietly, some of the views and philosophies of these two sides or one of these two sides, and then people in the culture kind of recognizing that, politicians recognizing that, teachers recognizing that, and being like, aha, like we see it there, we don't like that, we want to fight against that, all this kind of stuff. The same thing happens in education very, very much. You'll see teachers today and back then, very clearly pushing their philosophy. There's them saying, I prefer a communist system, I prefer a capitalist system, all this kind of stuff. So that's one really kind of on the surface, really clear way where we see the culture war happening. Now, again, for our purposes here, I want you to once again adopt the analytical mentality where you can tell me, here are the clear benefits of capitalism. Here are the clear reasons that there are benefits to communism and socialism, right? Give me the good points of both, and then give me the problems of the other ones, right? Like, what are the issues in both of these? I'll give you a hint. Capitalism has tremendous economic success. It has created more and more wealth than any other economic system in history, by far. That's a clear advantage. It allows more freedom. It allows more kind of prosperity. Whereas the negative part of capitalism is that it does produce inequality. Any form of competition produces inequality. There are going to be losers. There's going to be a lot more people making a lot fewer people making a lot more money. And there's going to be a lot of people who are just not making that much money. So it's not an everybody wins game. There's going to be a lot of quote unquote economic losers. Whereas in communism and socialism, a clear positive aspect to this is that it is trying to address that problem. It is trying to provide either social safety networks or kind of a redistribution of wealth that will help and secure those people who, because of their own fault or because of the fault of society and the fault of, just the happenstance of the world, are not able to do as well as other groups and as other people. And then a clear bad side of communism is, of course, that in principle, it is taking the freedom and taking the materials away from the people who have earned their materials already, or who have, by their own brilliance or whatever means, have been able to be very successful. There is also, at least, I'll leave it there. That's kind of the main, as a pure policy and kind of economic policy discussion and philosophy, that's probably the major issue therein. There are other issues. There are many other issues at a deeper, more cultural level, especially when we try to look at how capitalism and communism have been enacted in societies throughout the past 100+ years. We see some other real serious problems, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But let's shift over now to the cultural policies of the world, or of America more specifically. We see America really kind of being the hub of where these things are happening and being discussed. Okay, so the first one to look at is civil rights, generally speaking, I think. Yeah, just civil rights. Now, here we see the return of that old issue of racism, again, that we saw during the discussion on slavery during the Enlightenment. We see a conflict between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. And it says here, when facing the challenges of the unequal treatment of ethnic minorities, aka Black people, African Americans, the cultures of lynching and the past injustice of slavery, some believe peaceful protest and judicial action is the way forward. Others believe using force and intimidation is more necessary and more effective. Okay, so we have two different philosophies here. We have someone who is saying we need to use nonviolent, peaceful, heartfelt values to move forward, values that appeal to the Judeo-Christian roots of America and therefore will help us gain more rights and more respect in society. Then we have another group that is saying, no, we need to use our own intimidation and our own passion for our justice and force, if necessary, to get what we want. That's Malcolm X versus Martin Luther King Jr. Okay. So Martin Luther King is more nonviolence. Malcolm X was a little bit more in favor of using intimidating and even forceful tactics at times. So which position, as it's asking you here, is better or worse? We're looking for the pro and cons, okay? So MLK, Malcolm X, what are some reasons we would support MLK's point of view? What are some reasons we would support Malcolm X's point of view? Okay, what are some reasons that they both have validity to them? And then same thing. What are some of the problems in MLK's position? What are some of the problems in Malcolm X's position? Okay, they both do have problems. So explain that. Explain those to us. What are the drawbacks? What are the benefits of both sides? We're going to do that, by the way, for each of these following issues. Okay, now for the next one, we have the civil rights question of, let's take a look. What is it? It is abortion, right? So, very controversial issue. It's been since the 1970s. It still is today. The pill and abortion. With the advent of technology that allows women to avoid getting pregnant, the debate about the use of abortion began with people desiring women to have the freedom and privilege to choose when they want to continue a pregnancy versus whether they have the right to kill the developing child in their womb. Okay, so big issue. You have this pill come out, which says, hey, you can, have sex essentially without much concern for getting pregnant. So you can have the pregnancy pill that stops you from getting pregnant in general. Versus, we now have this other piece of a medical procedure where we can essentially stop a pregnancy. We can kind of remove the embryo, we can remove the child, we can kill the child, we kill the embryo, whatever word you want to use to stop the pregnancy. You can easily see the controversy here. One side is going to say, hey, that is totally fine. That is a civil right. Women should be allowed to do this. This is their bodies. This is their, life they're making. These are their choices they're choosing to, govern. Whereas the other side is saying, no, this is very clearly killing, right? This is you're killing some form of life is dying there. And some people say that is a valuable form of life, very clearly aligned with the value of human life, that this is wrong. And thus we have a huge conflict therein, right? America originally did make abortion legal during this period. But here we are in 2024, a couple of years ago, we actually overruled that. We said, no, that some states have the right to ban abortion. So it's an incredibly divisive and very, very, interesting topic for that reason. I particularly like this reason, like this issue, because it highlights, ladies and gents, what we were talking about all the way back in the Enlightenment, even in the Renaissance to some degree, which is this tension between part of our culture and civilization that has been founded on very Judeo-Christian values, right? We have that soil and the production of society from that Judeo-Christian soil and the values therein, versus some people and some movements in our culture and society that are saying, no, we want to kind of get away from that. We want to move from that and progress past it. That is what we are seeing essentially play out here. And I'm trying to be really, really delicate with this one. We have on the pro-life side, right, the pro or the anti-abortion side, people who don't want abortion to be a thing, a very clear sort of what would you want to call it, example of that Judeo-Christian spirit, right? Usually, if you're being really consistent with Judeo-Christian values, you're anti-abortion, you're against that. And by the way, Christians have been like that since the very beginning with the apostles. The Christian church has been 100% against abortion from that starting point. Whereas in other cultures and other worldviews have been much more pro abortion and pro choice and all this kind of stuff that said you get to do what you want with that sort of thing. And we see that conflict as we become more and more we move more and more into the more secular worldview. We have that conflict now between, are we going to stay with the kind of traditional roots of our value system, or are we going to kind of move towards something different and progress, regress, whatever you want to call it, past that or below that? What, again, welcome to the debate. That's what you have in abortion. Now, for this one, same thing. Tell me, what are the pros and cons on both sides? Like, what arguments are really good? Actually, what is it asking for here? And that's a little bit different than that. It's not pro and cons, or it's not arguments for or against. Articulate the two sides of the issue and what the most powerful arguments. Yeah, arguments for on each side. So, what are the best arguments for abortion? What are the best arguments for being pro-life, or I'm sorry, pro-choice? What are the best arguments against abortion? And same thing, like, what are the worst ones? What are the best? What are the worst arguments on both sides? What are the worst points on both sides? So you can play around with that, have fun with that debate as much as you could. Now, and by the way, we're going to look more at that in ninth grade. That's one of our major debating issues for ninth grade for our argument unit. Okay. Then we have this emergence of essentially the whole LGBT, the gay rights activism in the later part of the 20th century, where we have what? We have the protests and debates surrounding the cultural and legal view of gay relationships, beginning with some desiring less discrimination or less protection based on their sexuality, while other desiring society not to normalize or condone what they view as unhealthy, disordered, or dangerous sexual behavior. Okay, once again, welcome to that distinction between the Judeo-Christian values and the more progressive values, okay? The more, moving a culture that's going to move away from those foundations. Judeo-Christian culture is very clearly a culture that is anathema to same-sex relationships and same-sex behavior, right? It doesn't really like this sort of stuff. There's clear roots for that and clear traditions of that throughout history. Although many people, nowadays especially, try to sort of push back against that, even from a Christian perspective, try to say, it might be a little bit more complicated and more nuanced. Be that as it may, the culture is very much anti, same-sex relationships and same-sex behavior. And now we have, with the advent of more and more secularization, more and more kind of movement away from those traditions and those religious worldviews, you have a desire to therefore live as one would want to live. And so we have this conflict between, we want to be a liberal, value-based culture, but we also, don't know if we want to allow the normalization of some of these behaviors that some people don't agree with, right? So it's a really interesting back and forth debate, even a legal point. So it has been, of course, since the emergence of the issues. It has been, I think it was, I can't remember what year it was. I think it was during Obama's presidency. Yeah, that gay marriage was essentially passed as a thing that is legal and we should be able to do legally in America. And the issue, I think, much more so than abortion, has sort of died away and not become a major point of controversy as much as it was like when I was in high school. So there's that. Now, I think there was, let's see, one more on there. Let's see, the same sex. Okay, so yeah, our last question to explore for this particular segment is this. In what ways can we see at least 3 of these conflicts coming to a head since the medieval era? Where do the conflicts have some origins in history, right? So from the medieval era, when we see that, real laying the foundations, laying the soil of the Judeo-Christian kind of worldview and values in society. Since then, where do we see some of these issues start to take root, right? We saw the movement, for example, away from racist behavior and racist policies in the origins of Christianity. We saw that happening. We also saw kind of the movement away from the Christian values in secularism during the Enlightenment. So a lot of different, roots to these issues, a lot of different kind of origins of these ideologies starting even back then. Okay, now let's see. I think if I remember correctly, there was one other point that I wanted to go through before moving forward. And I think I actually want to save that until our next discussion. So that's the quick discussion about the culture wars. Okay. Now we're going to have one more video, which is going to conclude the 20th century and conclude the course, where we're going to talk about some of the general movements of the arts with novels, with movies, with all this kind of stuff happening during this period. And we'll touch a little bit on how the culture wars have influenced that as well. Okay. So that's all we have for today. Thank you very much. And I hope you have a fantastic day, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.